So hello, everybody. In today's class, we're going to start with the later part of the 20th century, but just a few final slides speaking about civil rights, which we were discussing last time. We ended off with a famous moment in sports, which seemed to be a precursor of other moments that would come to pass, say, in the 21st century. I guess the last thing to say about this is that civil rights was a kind of multi-dimensional process that involved many different strains, groups of people, even single gestures in some instances, and there are lots of different kinds of grassroots movements, we could say, to resistance to persecution and oppression. And I think too often in the mainstream constellation, there's this idea of just seeing the civil rights movements as it's described, typically from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. Well, that was part of it. And the official kind of mainstream version of it, as I mentioned last time, was the March on Washington with Martin Luther King Jr., which was a big thing in and of itself, but it's not the entire story. I mentioned the Black Power movement previously. There you see some artwork from the Black Panther newspaper. Here you had a different strain of civil rights. But here, too, was a movement, we could say, that harkened back to the ideals of American culture and society. I mean, if the Martin Luther King Jr. civil rights movement was about forcing America to live up to its democratic ideals, forcing it to live up to the ideals enshrined in the Constitution, as well as in the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, here was a different version of revisiting the heritage of America, but the revolutionary heritage of America. Because recall, Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, was this figure who advocated for continuous rebellion and revolution. You see some of his quotes. Mentioned previously that he, back in his day, was a slave owner, although he did oppose the transatlantic slave trade. But here are his comments on a revolution in general. What country ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And also, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical, it is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. And this is, again, one of the presidents of the United States speaking there. So there are all sorts of different ways to reconnect to the heritage of America. I would say, I mean, it's a bit false to kind of summarize an entire movement briefly and glibly, but the Black Power movement seemed to speak directly to that idea of revolution within America, not just a revolutionary uprising to transform the entire society, but also a revolution of the mind as well, which was a big part of the literature and arts movement at the time. So not just the kind of forceful overthrow of the existing social order or change within the social order, but also a change in a way of thinking, a change in a way of perceiving one's surroundings. A couple of people I mentioned earlier, or I mentioned Anna Julia Cooper earlier. I'm not sure if I mentioned Ida B. Wells, but this other idea of the Black Power movement, which is important to think about in relation to civil rights, we should also resist the idea that civil rights was always just about the process of desegregation, because it kind of leads into this notion that the aspiration for a lot of African Americans was to simply do the same things that white Americans could do, to sit in the same places on the bus or to attend the same educational institutions, to live in the same neighborhoods. Again, that's kind of been the mainstream version of events, I would say, that it was just about integration and assimilation. But the Black Power movement kind of takes it in another direction and speaks to the uniqueness of the African American experience within the United States and says, well, here you have an ethnic group, a nation that has existed basically since before America was even a country. Again, we trace the roots all the way back to the 1600s, and there is a singularity and uniqueness to their experiences within this country. And this taps into another different version of heritage. We look at some early Black feminist thinkers, writers, activists, philosophers like Wells and Cooper, and they, in many cases, advocated exactly that idea, the uniqueness of Black women's experiences in America. They were individuals who said, well, if you talk about ideals of a democracy, ideals of virtue and morality, there are some individuals who are in a very strong position to understand those kinds of ideals precisely due to their experiences within this country. The 19th century, Cooper, you can see, lived just about forever, but she was writing in the 1800s. That was the era of this notion of true womanhood and the idea that women's contribution to culture should involve the work of raising virtuous people. I mean, that was basically the kind of cult of true womanhood at the time. And that's the way that we ensure the development of a just and free and fair society, is if you raise people to be moral, upstanding individuals and citizens. Well, that was basically her argument, is that Black women, due to their direct experiences with institutionalized oppression, due to their experiences with a legally codified version of immorality, are in a very good position to understand the importance of morality, the importance of conveying that to young people, because they experience what happens when immorality, so to speak, is codified within the nation state. So not just this idea of integration and assimilation, but also bringing out the multifaceted, different versions of the uniqueness of African American experience and culture within America. So now, in the rest of today's class, move into the late 20th century. As the itinerary today, a couple of smaller snapshots, I would say, from this period: Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, the energy crisis and the environment, the 1980s and the end of the Cold War, and the 1990s. And as with some of the previous classes, the last subject can kind of spill over into future sessions. The Vietnam War. Say there are a couple of topics to think about: a distant war and then also a war close to home, which are kind of two different perspectives, but not mutually contradictory. The Vietnam War, which extended between 1955 and 1975, and initially was an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial war, because this region of the world, Indochina, which includes not just Vietnam, but the neighboring countries as well, such as Cambodia, had been part of the French Empire. Well, I mentioned this in a previous class. The latter part of the 20th century saw the collapse of the European empires, which included not just the British Empire, but the French Empire as well. And Vietnam was one of those nations that had been a colony of France. And so this started out initially as a war for independence on the part of the Vietnamese, but it transformed into a different kind of war, ended up being a struggle over the future direction of the country. It was basically accepted that Vietnam was going to be an independent nation state, but the question was, what kind of political system was it going to have, and also what kind of economic system was it going to have as well? And this is why the United States became increasingly involved in the war in the early 1960s, not from the start. They were present to a degree in the 1950s in an advisory role, but in terms of a full-fledged involvement of America, as in American soldiers going to Vietnam, that happened in the early 60s, with them steadily escalating the number of military personnel until you had close to 3 million American soldiers ultimately serving in the war. As you can see there, a war in Vietnam is about this country, but it was ultimately involved more than just the two sides, basically North Vietnam and South Vietnam, split in the middle of the country. Those were the two kind of sides fighting, but there were various others, including lurking prominently in the background, the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as the People's Republic of China, which gives you a sense of the war effectively being about communism versus capitalism. American involvement in Vietnam seemed to rest on assumptions about a binary structure to global politics. That was the justification, because if you look at a map, one thing that strikes you immediately is Vietnam is a hell of a long way away from the United States. So the immediate thought is, why are American soldiers even involved there in the first place? Well, the simplest explanation is that it comes down to exactly what I mentioned previously, this vision of a very dichotomous world, split between the communist world and the capitalist world. I showed you that map previously. Well, that was the reality in Europe. When you look at Eastern Europe with the Soviet bloc and Western Europe supported by the United States and the NATO military organization, there was that kind of sense of bifurcation. And that was basically the way that American foreign policy read the world as a whole. You basically have these two massive camps. So when China becomes a communist regime, for instance, there's this assumption that they've fallen in to the other camp. So that's basically the idea with Vietnam. If Vietnam becomes a communist state, backed by China and backed by the Soviet Union, well, this is a sign of the spread of this hostile enemy ideology further around the world, a sign that America is effectively losing its global war on communism, but again, a cold war, not a constant war, but they're basically losing the upper hand, hence the reason to intervene or get involved in Vietnam. Basic misreading of the situation, just the way the Soviet Union would misread situations in places like Afghanistan, for instance, later on, because the Vietnam War was not about Vietnam becoming a puppet state of the USSR or China. It was first and foremost about the sovereignty and independence of the Vietnamese people. Indeed, the North Vietnamese communists, the communists were the North Vietnamese regime at the time, they thought first and foremost about self-determination and communism as feeding into this idea of national autonomy. So their interest was always first and foremost with being an independent state without being beholden to another country. Yes, they would be friendly towards the USSR and China just because of the shared ideology and political values, but first and foremost, there was this idea of them on their own. And thus, consequently, of course, they were going to regard the American intervention as basically another imperialist intervention. I mean, that was basically their perspective, that you have this foreign power, this kind of mega superpower state, sending its soldiers into the country, trying to take over the country, trying to tell you what to do. And so the perspective of the people there is once again fighting against this mega imperialist state, which is attempting to dictate the course of their future life. Of course, the fascinating and also bizarre thing is that the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese communists, or the Viet Cong, as they became known, ultimately won the war. And you might wonder, well, how could this smallish country win a war against the greatest military power in the world? Well, that too was a kind of instructive thing, and based on a fundamental misreading of the situation in Vietnam. Vietnam became the era of a kind of guerrilla-style warfare, which was in many instances a kind of decentralized way of waging war, where you just have pockets and groups of people, different versions of insurgents, kind of fragmented to an extent, and there's these constant ongoing recruitment drives, and it's about capturing the minds of people first and foremost, as opposed to just organizing everyone into a single battalion or something like that. And it's just this continuous ongoing process of insurgency, attack and counterattack, and just hanging in there for as long as possible. And as history has proven in recent years, that's precisely the way a country like Vietnam can win a war against America. That is how a country like Afghanistan can win a war against America, because the Taliban won the war against the United States. America would never actually admit that that's what happened very recently, but that is what happened over the course of, 2 decades? 20 years? How did the Taliban defeat America? They just never stopped fighting. That's all it was. They just kept going year after year after year. New recruitments, new insurgencies, and they just wore the occupiers out until eventually they just went home. So that's basically the story of Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack launched by the Viet Cong, that's the North Vietnamese communists, in 1968 that resulted in thousands of casualties, and that swung the momentum of the war. The Viet Cong actually did not win that particular offensive. They lost it, but it was such a surprise attack, and it was a slow, bloody, and devastating for both sides that it really put the lie to the idea that America was winning the war, because, of course, that was the narrative that was being propagated in the media at the time, all the way up until 1968. The United States is gradually winning the war in Vietnam. It's just a matter of time. Well, this particular offensive basically made it increasingly difficult to believe that that was what was happening. The war was just dragging out endlessly. Again, similar situation in Afghanistan. Eventually, it was very difficult to believe that America and its allies were winning that war, because there was no sign of it coming to any kind of end. This particular event, you see a noticeable decline in American troop morale, which followed, leading to the eventual withdrawal of U.S. soldiers in 1973. Predates the end of the war, which was in 75. All sorts of stories of American soldiers basically losing the will to fight in Vietnam. There was the outright disobeying of orders, some desertion, drug use was very high among soldiers, and in many cases, just doing that kind of thing in warfare of pretending to go on patrol, or saying, okay, we're going to go to this place and look for insurgents or members of the Viet Cong, but really they just find a place to bunker down, and they falsely radio back various updates on their positions and stuff like that. I mean, that became the kind of norm after 68. The war, as I say, was distant in the sense that here was a war that was being fought in Indochina, many miles away from the United States, and it was difficult from the start, but particularly difficult after a while to understand what America was even trying to accomplish there. So a kind of distant war, distant from America's specific interests, but also close to home in the sense that this was really the first war that was captured in graphic images and television as well. It became known as a kind of television war, not in the sense that it was fought on TV, but in the sense that scenes of warfare, brutal, devastating scenes of warfare were brought into American homes. Now, that had not been the case previously with World War I or World War II. People heard about the war. There were newspaper updates, but it wasn't the kind of thing where journalists or photographers would capture images of the war and present them to the public. No, everything was kind of kept at that abstract level. They didn't have the infrastructure to do that kind of thing, but it was different in the 1960s. There you see a famous photo of the summary execution of the Viet Cong officer, 1968, right around the time of the Tet Offensive. There's precisely images like this, the realities of warfare, the use of napalm, the kind of devastation of war, which galvanized growing opposition to the war back home. So the anti-war movement was fed off of precisely these kinds of images. It's just what I said about television previously. On the one hand, TV could bring people sanitized sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy, and can present a very kind of glossy, finished image of American culture. But it also allows for the circulation of images and ideas and potentially dissent as well. It's easier to kind of galvanize this resistance and dissent over a short period of time. And opposition to the war became a crucial part of the counterculture movement. So, as I say, the war ends, as far as America's involvement goes, in 1973, and then the war officially ends in 75 with the victory of the Vietnamese communists. And that war, the kind of fallout from it, was in many respects a kind of national shaming for America, but also something that would seem to set a trend for a lot of America's interventions subsequently. You think of subsequent wars that America has been involved in, including Afghanistan and Iraq, this sense of the ongoing inability to fight against a foe that regards them simply as imperialist occupiers and invaders. Something else to mention from the 1970s, the Watergate scandal, and there are a couple of subjects to think about in relation to this. Weaponizing partisan politics, which sounds very familiar in the 21st century context, and also revealing a personality. The Watergate scandal, which was such a huge thing at the time and seemed to set a trend for American cultural life and politics and democracy for the rest of the 20th century. This involved Richard Nixon, President of the United States from 1969 to 1974. He was elected once, and then he was actually reelected in a landslide in a very kind of one-sided election in 72. But his second term ended in total disgrace. Facing impeachment, he was forced to resign the presidency in August of 1974, the only American president to actually resign during the presidency. And unlike in the case of Donald Trump, who was, of course, impeached twice, in the case of Nixon, it was evident that an impeachment against him would be successful, hence the reason that he resigned, because he did not have the support of Congress. So what happened here with the Watergate scandal? You might have heard about this event in American cultural history and politics, but what exactly was it? Well, interesting story. 1972, a small group of people, I think there were about 5 of them total, were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in D.C. There you see the complex, hence the name of the scandal. And so that from the start was this kind of interesting story of who exactly are these people who are breaking into this political party's headquarters. Well, it turns out that these people were hired by the Committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP as it became known, aptly known within the media. So in other words, this was a committee devoted to re-electing Richard Nixon, who was running for president. And so this committee was involved in hiring people to be involved basically in criminal activities. I mean, that's what they were doing. They're breaking into these headquarters to try and access secure, classified documents. And why were they doing that? Well, of course, they were seeking out information about the Democratic Party. They were, in other words, looking for dirt, looking for something that they could use. This caused a sensation once it actually started to come to light, because through subsequent investigations, the FBI was able to uncover a series of illegal fundraising activities, subversion of opposition political candidates, and the use of White House, quote, plumbers, that's basically the people who were caught breaking in, to conduct break-ins and wiretaps to destroy political enemies. So this kind of activity, this sort of subversion from within, was happening as far back as the 1970s, of getting people on the sly to conduct these various illegal activities. You see the J. Edgar Hoover building, home of the FBI. And the fallout from the Watergate scandal revealed earlier efforts by the Nixon administration to coordinate, politicize, and weaponize the work of American intelligence agencies. And as I said, well, that must sound familiar in the contemporary context. Here, too, is something that has been going on for quite a long time. Turns out that Nixon's administration had been interested in coordinating the activities of intelligence agencies like the FBI and the CIA, bringing them together in order to combat what they regarded as subversion in American society. Now, initially, this had actually been directed against opposition to the Vietnam War. That's basically where they were starting. We need more in the way of intelligence agency coordination to spy on citizens or conduct wiretaps or do whatever we can to find out where the opposition and subversion to the Vietnam War is coming from. So you start with that, but then it's kind of a small step to move on from that to start trying to use the intelligence agencies to target political opponents. So not even people who are necessarily dissenters in American society, but just people who represent oppositional political parties. Now, there was resistance at the time within the agencies, but it's not like today. I mean, these kinds of things would take a long time to come to light, but there was resistance in the sense that the purpose of the agencies is not supposed to be to pool their resources in order to destroy individual citizens, right? That's not supposed to be the idea of the agencies. The idea is to actually ferret out legitimate threats to national security. So this whole kind of process of coordination and complicity within it came to light over the course of the Watergate scandal. Something else, too, was revealed in 1973. That Nixon had actually installed a sophisticated recording system in the Oval Office and other locations in the White House. Now, this was not the first time a president had done this, nor was it the last time. I'm not sure the exact numbers on subsequent presidents who did stuff like this, but it wasn't a completely unusual activity. This was so the political leaders could record and keep track of conversations that they were having, so they could remember the exchanges they'd had with people and could call them back at a later date. What I think was unique about Nixon's recording system that he installed was that it was voice activated. In other words, as soon as someone would start speaking, the system would turn itself on. Now, I think other presidents as well did it selectively, where they would manually turn on the system themselves. That's the reason why we don't have any kind of, hidden Bill Clinton sex tapes out there anywhere from the Oval Office. But with Nixon, it was sort of like all the conversations were recorded. And so the release of the tapes in 1974 revealed exchanges and conversations that Nixon probably would have preferred to keep private and secretive, including his direct involvement in the Watergate cover-up. That became the kind of smoking gun evidence where something like a week after these people had been caught breaking into the Democrat Party's headquarters, a week later, Nixon basically acknowledged that his administration was responsible for this and ordered the cover-up. That was released subsequently, and that's the reason why he was going to be impeached successfully. So, hence the reason why he resigned. But the other thing that became interesting about this was that the recording of all of these private conversations, these private exchanges, revealed aspects of his personality as well as the presidency itself. And here was something that was kind of new as well, because you have, of course, the glossy veneer, the kind of surface image that any politician attempts to construct, and it's this kind of sanitized image of the political leader, and for the most part, they are just in character. They're playing a part, essentially, on the screen. It always kind of raises the question of, what is the person actually like underneath it all? If you see them in a kind of personal environment where they are just themselves, what are they actually like? And that was kind of partly what was revealed with Richard Nixon with these kinds of secretive tapes. Got to see his personality and his identity. Someone as this kind of a deeply paranoid, suspicious person who swore all the time and had all sorts of kind of random views and opinions, and who had this kind of disdain and contempt for the average American person who had elected him. Well, finally an honest politician, right? And also someone who kind of had this idea that the rule of law is just there to be bent and twisted as the situation sees fit. When he's speaking about the Watergate scandal, for instance, he's talking in one instance on one of the tapes about how he's sick and tired of high-minded lawyers and all these legal rules and regulations. Sometimes you just have to win a case in the press, he says. So not win it legally, but just through a kind of public opinion. Get the public on your side, even if what you're doing is legally wrong and dodgy. Says at another point, I'm sick and tired of high-minded lawyers. Get me a son of a bitch. Get me someone like me, right? That's the kind of stuff that is revealed on these tapes. So you have this kind of process of turning an identity inside out and revealing it on the larger stage. And I mean, I think it's a kind of anticipatory thing that comes up later. Donald Trump was the kind of, he's like the end result in a way of someone like Richard Nixon. But in his case, there isn't even really the filtering mechanism anymore. It's just there he is as this person, paranoid and suspicious and this kind of friendless, brutal person, all that put on immediate display. Also, the inner workings of the presidency. This was another kind of interesting aspect of the Watergate tapes. It kind of just reveals how the presidency really functions underneath it all. Well, you have the president, and you have a kind of small circle of people around him. Really not a lot of people when you get down to it. Of course, the president has to be the kind of person who's out there meeting everybody, shaking everyone's hand, pretending he's kind of friendly with all these different people. But when you get down to it, it's just a small circle of advisors around him, this little cabal of people who are basically trying to manage whatever crisis happens to arise. And that's what we see with the Watergate scandal. They realize that they've been caught in this illegal activity of trying to subvert their political opponents, and subsequently you see them working through the process of trying to deal with that, and of course that is revealed subsequently as well. The impeachment of Nixon, I mean, it's the kind of thing where you can't even really imagine it today, because this was a kind of issue where there seemed to be this kind of higher ideal or higher principle about honesty or transparency within American government, but the partisan splits are so staunch and rigid in the 21st century that the kind of weaponization of the intelligence agencies is almost taken for granted on both sides, right, of the political aisle. It's almost this kind of thing that's par for the course in the 21st century. So how American politics and society have sort of changed over time. Another subject to raise in relation to the 1970s, the energy crisis and the environment. We'll get to what happened after Nixon in a moment, because here's something that overlaps with this in the year 1973. You see the crisis of 1973 setting the debate and what happened to nature. This, too, was another one of those stories which was huge at the time that it happened, the Watergate scandal, but also the energy crisis or oil crisis, which occurred in 1973. The further along in time we go, the more we kind of forget these issues, these flashpoints. But make no mistake, it was one of those things that everyone was talking about when it occurred. In 1973, a number of oil-producing nations led by Saudi Arabia imposed an oil embargo on countries that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, which is a war which was fought between Israel and some of its neighboring states. These were countries which were predominantly Arabic countries, which were major producers of petroleum and oil. This was a response to certain countries backing Israel, and that included the United States. And so they they imposed this oil embargo, and this triggered a large increase in the cost of petroleum. This would have to be considered the real first major crisis in relation to fossil fuels. I mean, of course, people have been aware of fossil fuels previously in all sorts of different sectors and different contexts, but here it was kind of blown up into a major moment of national crisis because suddenly there was a perception of a shortage in the availability of this very crucial product. This is one of the things that it was easy for the average American citizen to forget. Whole process of industrialization been going on in the United States since the 1800s, thanks to its role as a former member of the British Empire as a colony. Industrialization had come early to America, and that had been central to the transformation of this country into the vast urban grid that it became over the course of the 1800s and 1900s. As I mentioned previously, by the time you get into the interwar period, even before then, but especially during the interwar period, America is clearly the leading economic superpower in the world, this massive industrial manufacturing nation state with its vast resources and factories and cities and all of those different things. None of that stuff means anything in the 20th century context if you don't have petroleum. Right? You have to have fossil fuel in order to make all of that stuff run. All of your cities, all of your machinery, all of your cars, all of your factories, your lighting systems, whatever you care to name. Green energy, not on the radar at all at this time. No, it is all about oil. It is all about natural gas. It is all about coal. That is the black gold, the manna that makes the entire system run. And if you don't have those things, you don't have anything. So here is where the crisis kind of erupts at this time, because America had indeed been calling upon Arabic oil-producing countries increasingly in the early 1970s. So the idea that the taps were going to be shut off precipitated this massive crisis, which reached the individual consumer level, with reportages of gas shortages at various gas stations, but also a whole sort of network of ideas about conserving energy, which hadn't really been a big thing in America previously. I mean, we hear today about the need to be environmentally responsible, to conserve energy, to reduce the carbon footprint. I mean, that was barely on people's radar previously, but suddenly now it was a very significant thing. You could say that this was a real new snag in narratives of unending growth, consumption, and progress. That narrative is never actually true when you get down to it, and it can run aground through all sorts of different ways. In the 1920s, it was really the stock market crash that killed off that narrative, at least at that time, because there you also had an idea of unending growth and prosperity, more money, bigger, better, faster, on and on into the future. Well, stock market crash comes, takes the wind out of those sails, and you have 10 years worth of depression. Here you have another version of it, I would say, in the early 1970s. Again, endless consumption, endless building of products, endless kind of new cars and new machines and everything becoming more and more industrialized. Well, not necessarily, actually, because fossil fuels, in addition to being this commodity bought and sold, are also limited, finite, right? They don't last forever. The more we use them, the more we use them up, and they're also destructive to the environment. So this was a kind of new version of that kind of revenge against this narrative, which just tells us to consume and spend as much as possible indefinitely into the future. Anxiety over fossil fuels fed into debates about the future, which seemed to revolve around the possibility that either the environment or civilization, or maybe both, would soon collapse. And that sounds also pretty familiar to us today in the 21st century, because that seems to be the kind of basic binary, at least as far as American politics is concerned. This idea that obviously we need to curb over-reliance on fossil fuels, or else it is going to be completely destructive to the natural environment. Already is destructive to the natural environment, and you can see that developing with increasing drought, desertification, inclement weather, flooding, all of those things potentially happening. Well, the other side says, well, if we don't have all of this industry and production, civilization is going to collapse, right? So it's the other side of things where it's all just going to come crashing down because we rely on this wealth-generating industry as well as the kind of machinery of the modern nation state. So it's a kind of, two-sided anxiety. And of course, they kind of meet in the middle. The kind of underlying narrative as well, we are moving right now into a grim, destructive future. The sands in the hourglass are running out, and both the environment and civilization will collapse, probably simultaneously, which, increasingly is looking like what will happen, right? Both of them will be destroyed all at the same time. Both certainty and uncertainty about the future existed in a precarious balance in these debates when they were first starting in the 1970s. And I would say they still exist in that kind of balance today. You hear it, this idea of, on the one hand, the future is this thing to fear because this is where this destruction, devastation is going to occur in the future. And we don't know exactly what form it's going to take. All we know is that there's going to be this disaster, this calamity, which is going to arrive soon. So that's on the one hand, that kind of uncertainty. But then on the other hand, there's also the certainty that we know exactly what's going to happen. Right? We know we've charted the development of fossil fuel consumption. We've tracked weather patterns, climate change, and pollution. And we know precisely the trend we're moving in. And it's this kind of inexorable movement, this kind of decline. And I would say that this kind of combination of being very sure about what's going to happen and also at the same time totally unsure about what's going to happen, it kind of defines in some ways this sort of era of anxiety about fossil fuel and petroleum, and it's become a very kind of 21st century thing. We've never been more certain about the future and more uncertain about it simultaneously all at once. So I'll take the break now and come back in 10 minutes.